Hello, and welcome back to Learn It from a Layman. I am Carl Christensen, joined tonight by Matt and first-time podcast guest Joel. Uh, Joel is my cousin, Joel Christensen. Uh, we've had your family on, Joel, so people are familiar with Ian and Michelle. Um, I don't know how often you claim that relationship, but anything you would like to say to either own or disown your family?
I would just like to say that I find it a little disturbing that I am the last and, well, almost nearly the last member of the family to be invited on the podcast. I'll try not to hold it against you, but
Oh
I
yeah,
just
the
feel like that
save
is
the best for last kind of thing. That might be what's happening. Maybe.
Yeah, yeah. See, there you go. Of course, we had your dad on first. So, anyway, but we haven't had your mom on yet, and we have to have. I mean, we got to collect the whole crew now. So, um, anyway, Joel is living in China right now, and but is we won't say an expert because on Learn It from a Layman we don't have. Well, we do have some experts, but Joel is a EV enthusiast with some knowledge in the area, and so we're going to be talking
by
about
EV, we mean
electric vehicle.
there we go.
We're going to be talking about electric vehicles. Joel's got some information to share with us, and we're going to be discussing what EVs are, how they're being used, and what the future is for EVs. So Joel, what give us kind of a current rundown of what electric vehicles are and what they're good for and what they're not good for.
all right. Happy to do that. As you said, Carl, I'm not an expert, and so some of the facts
Fit
and
in then.
figures that I'm going to tell you are, I would say, ballpark accurate.
Okay.
We'll put it that way. The spirit of what I'm saying, I believe, is true. Some
That's
of
quite an
the
upgrade for our
years
normal
and exact
podcast.
figures may not be correct. EVs, first of all, have been around for a long time in one form or another. I think that the first electronic vehicle was like prototype, kind of in the lab. You could trace that all the way back to the 1960s. And the first commercially available EVs were available in the 80s, but they suffered from bad marketing. The battery technology wasn't really there. They had terrible range. There wasn't the infrastructure to support EVs, and they were expensive. And to some extent, these same problems, what I've just listed, have plagued electronic vehicles up until probably really Teslas started coming out, and they started Teslas um, kind of started conquering the marketing problem, right? And then it started tackling to some degree some of these other issues, because over the decades, right, people had this impression of EVs as unreliable, almost an afterthought or maybe a joke, right? And if you look at pictures of EVs from the 1980s, I think you can see where they got that impression. They're very nerdy looking cars, which to some consumers is not an obstacle, but many people would prefer a car that doesn't look like that. But Teslas, as everyone knows, I mean, they're relatively ubiquitous now. Um, Kind of we're real trailblazers in that regard. As far as I understand, their batteries were not significantly better necessarily than anyone else, and now they don't even, at least here in China, they don't make their own batteries. But they were able to convince the consumer that this is a desirable product, that this is something that you should want, which is kind of step one, right? When you're trying to change a whole market, an existing market to break in, um, and then slowly over time in the United States, you've seen some of these other barriers fall down, with the rollout of more charging infrastructure, um, and as some of the advantages of electronic vehicles become apparent as well, because they do have significant advantages over ICEs, right, internal combustion engines, and those advantages I think that if they were starting from an equal, starting line, if ICEs and EVs were both, had been like all things being equal, I think EVs probably would have won. And the reason I think that is because that they are mechanically much simpler, right? I mean, you can see that even in the relatively short amount of time that, for example, Teslas and other cars have been on the road. Obviously, they can brake, and they do brake, and there are issues maybe with the software or some of the electronic systems, but the mechanics of an EV are very simple, right? You have one or two electronic motors that turn the wheels, and then those connections to the battery, right? Compared to the mechanical intricacy of an internal combustion engine.
Right.
And I don't know, is that enough of an introduction?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great introduction. I had a couple follow-up questions from what you were just talking about. One, I was interested, and maybe we talk about this more later if you want, but the EV market in the United States. I live in the United States, and you obviously are familiar with the States as well. I'm wondering what the international market looks like as far as like Teslas in California are the main EV, right? Like that's
right.
Of course, there are other EVs out there, but 90%. I don't actually know what the stats are, but it's a huge percentage of Teslas, right? Is that representative of international EVs? Do you know?
So EVs are still, I would say, a luxury vehicle in the sense that the, whatever term you want to use, global South, developing world, G77, these countries below a certain per capita income have a very low penetration rate. And part of that is because EVs generally are still more expensive than their equivalent ICE counterparts. But primarily it's because these other countries do not have the infrastructure necessary to support EVs, right? You just can't charge them. And that's,
right.
Kind of
that matters.
A non-starter in a lot of these places.
Non-starter.
I see what you did there. Yeah.
You do see in those markets a penetration of electronic scooters, right? And that actually, I would argue, more significant because in most of these places, that's much more what the electronic scooters are competing against are gas-powered scooters or motorcycles, which would be the primary form of transportation in many of these countries anyway, right? A lot of these places, they couldn't afford a car of any kind. Doesn't matter if it's an ICE or an EV. Now, in the countries above that kind of per capita point, right, income point, or maybe hovering around that, and I don't know exactly where it is, maybe $15,000 a year, you are seeing more EVs. But, in Europe, the United States, it is steadily increasing. I think the percentage of EVs that are being sold, both in absolute numbers and as a percentage of all total vehicle sales. Where it's really taken off, though, is here in China, where, again, these numbers are going to be a little bit off, but it took something like 10 years to get to the first million EVs sold, and then 2 years to get to the second. And then now I think they're selling somewhere in the range of 10 million EVs a year. And they anticipate that within the next year, maybe 2025, maybe 2026, 50% of all vehicles in China, which is the largest car market in the world. More cars are sold here every year than anywhere else, which makes sense. 50% of them will be, so I'm going to caveat this, they will be NEVs. And you are asking yourself, what on earth is an NEV? So China categorizes, they lump a whole bunch of things together. These are called new energy vehicles, which includes electric cars, it includes hybrid, it includes fuel cell, so like hydrogen, which is a very small percentage, but they lump all of those together into one category. So it's a little misleading. They're not all electric cars, but I would say the majority of those NEVs are electric cars, and they are selling millions of them. If you come to China in any first-tier city, which is Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, you will see a panoply of electric cars, and you can tell because they all have green lights.
Let's keep our language at a lay level here. I don't want to have to define panoply because I don't know what it is.
You will see a veritable a bewildering array. I feel like almost every day when I'm on the street,
A
I
plethora?
see a plethora, perhaps. Every day when I'm on the street, I feels like I see new brands of electronic vehicles that I've never seen before.
Wow. Okay. So that was my question then. So for all of these EVs being sold in China, are these all Chinese built EVs? Are these imports? What are they?
In the top 10 manufacturers of EVs in China, there's only one foreign company, Tesla.
Okay. Interesting.
And
All the-
Tesla is
the other
almost
9
not
are
even
all
foreign. They have a manufacturing plant out there in, is it like in Shenzhen or something?
in Shanghai. Yeah, they do
yeah.
have a very large manufacturing base here. I mean, but most cars that have been sold in China by foreign car companies are manufactured here. Relatively few are imports. Maybe like the higher end models,
Sure.
your Mercedes, Audis, Porsches, maybe.
Okay.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, we can come back. So we're going to talk a little bit about the infrastructure around EVs as well. I'd be interested to obviously know what that looks like in China. But before we do that, can we talk a little bit about EV batteries? Because you talked about in your opening, kind of rundown, EV battery improvement since the 1980s. What are the ranges for batteries these days? Like a fully electronic vehicle, I think the layman kind of generally expects that it's more than 100 miles, but I think unless you own a Tesla in the United States, you probably don't know exactly how far they go. And does that obviously then depend on the brand or the manufacturer? And are you familiar with what the battery scene looks like?
So the batteries are really the key and the heart of an electronic vehicle, and maybe that is a sort of obvious statement, but I think it bears repeating, because really everything that makes an electronic vehicle superior to an ICE or inferior really revolves around batteries.
Like all the pros and cons.
Now, battery technology. I'm sorry? You said the pros and the cons?
All the pros and cons of an EV really come down to the battery.
Right. And I'm not a chemical engineer, but what chemical engineers have told me is that batteries are about chemistry, and chemistry is usually an incremental science. So battery technology, lithium batteries have been around again for 40 or 50 years. They are not new. Lithium batteries are what I almost say almost all electronic vehicles use. They are a well understood technology, and they definitely come with certain downsides. They require a lot of expensive metals that are environmentally polluting and sometimes politically difficult to navigate. Kind of those industries, and they only come from a few places. The metals and lithium itself, it's relatively abundant. It's not super hard to come by, but it tends to be concentrated. The easily accessible reservoirs of lithium are in a few countries like Chile, Australia, and so it definitely comes with certain downsides. They, as everyone is probably aware, can catch on fire when they get a short or overheat, and they have a energy density limitation. Right? I mean, that's that's really what battery technology improvements are about, is trying to pack more energy into the same space, right? If you compare a lithium battery today to gasoline, a lithium battery might be 1/10 of what you can, an equivalent weight, right? A lithium battery in a car can weigh anywhere from 1 to 2,000 pounds or more. I mean, if you carried 1 to 2,000 pounds of gasoline in your car, you could go a considerable distance, right? Obviously, those are not, necessarily direct equivalents, but
Sure.
So battery technology right now, lithium is kind of the front runner. In terms of ranges, I would say a kind of middle range car, what you could probably expect minimum 200 miles per charge, and 3 or maybe even 400 is not out of the question. It does depend a lot on environmental temperatures. If it's colder,
Hmm.
then your battery will run out more slowly, or it will. Sorry, your battery will run out more quickly, and you will go a shorter distance before you'll need to recharge. And the battery degrades over time. So the more cycles that you run it through, the less charge it can retain. Usually kind of plateaus after a while at a relatively stable range, maybe 70 or 80% of the original capacity. Now, there are cars that are or batteries, I should say, that are being trialed, and some of them have even had prototypes that I've heard touted of up to 1,000 miles on a single charge. I think there was a company, it was either Neo or Li Auto. These are both Chinese companies, who the CEO drove one of their prototype cars. Maybe it was 1,000 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers from like Hangzhou to Guangzhou or Shenzhen on one charge. And I think he live streamed it.
That's crazy.
And yeah, but of course, to go from an experimental prototype to mass manufacturing, there's a lot that needs to happen, and it needs to go right. And there's, I think, real expectations need to be kind of kept in check. I don't think there's any like imminent breakthroughs. I mean, people are experimenting with all kinds of different chemistries and technology, but for now, I think in the next at least 2 to 3 years, it's hard to say for sure, but I think lithium batteries are probably where the industry is probably going to stay.
Yeah, so interesting. You noted earlier also that so the manufacturing of these batteries comes with potential environmental issues, right? Some pollution that comes from. Is it the mining or the manufacturing of the elements needed in these batteries? My understanding is that there are potential pollutants that that cause issues with the batteries. Is that true?
Yes. So there are kind of 3 stages, I guess, of battery, of creating batteries. First part is the extraction of the resources, then the refining, and then the actual manufacturing, like in a factory. In the extraction, mining is just kind of inherently polluting, especially, for example, cobalt. The world's largest reserves of cobalt are found in the Congo, which is a difficult operational environment. And so a lot of the cobalt comes from small scale miners who, let's just say, do not invest heavily in either safety or environmental protection measures. So that's polluting in and of itself. The refining of these metals can also be quite polluting, in the sense that they might be bound up with other metals, or the refining process requires the use of dangerous and damaging chemicals that, again, are not always handled appropriately. And the actual manufacturing itself, when it gets to the factory, I think probably the major polluting element is just they're quite energy intensive to manufacture. So if you're burning coal, if you're burning gas, to generate your electricity, then that's kind of a secondary or pollutant that is a result of this battery manufacturing.
Okay. Now, that isn't necessarily to try to discourage or to try to naysay the EV. I think I hear a lot of people complain that the manufacturing of the batteries or whatever is bad for the environment. So if we're getting EVs to help the environment, is this not, we just creating a different problem? But on the whole, EVs are very positive for the environment, right? The amount of greenhouse gases produced by EVs is zero, right? As far as once they're in that, once they're being driven around, and so the total amount of polluting that goes on, greenhouse gases and those types of issues, it really is a net large positive as far as environmental friendliness, right?
They are definitely more environmentally friendly or greener than an internal combustion engine, but how green they are depends significantly on the energy makeup of the grid in the country that you're in.
Right.
For energy being produced burning coal, well, then that's how you're charging your EV, right? So the EV itself,
right.
Yes, it does not release any carbon emissions or any really emissions at all. The other things you need to consider is on the back and the front end, right? So on the front end, manufacturing, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but some people, you can calculate how many emissions were created in the manufacture of the car, and then on the back end, after when the car is scrapped, right, there is a need for a more robust either recycling or disposal industry that will be able to handle tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of these very heavy batteries that are full of chemicals, right?
Interesting. Okay, right. I'd heard some of these things before, but yeah, it's nice to put these things in perspective. And you're saying there are numbers that can essentially map, an EV, as far as environmental friendliness, total emission numbers or whatever compared to your ICE vehicle.
Yeah, I mean, those are relatively simple to calculate. I think,
okay.
If you're just looking at the environmental impact of your vehicle, the electronic vehicle is obviously the way to go. One of the things that we haven't talked about, though, is just the economics of EVs, right? And the significant barrier that is to uptake. In most places, I would say that the number one concern of a buyer is the price.
Right.
And EVs, at least in the United States, I think are about $10,000 to $15,000 more expensive than their ICE equivalent. So a Toyota Corolla might cost $25,000 new, like a base model, and a Tesla Model 3 would be 40.
Yeah.
Right.
I actually did look into this a while ago, before Teslas were even really out there. Was looking at some of the early mainstream electronic vehicles, and there's a number of pros and cons to them that I think we're starting to get to beyond what we've already talked about. But the big one for me came down to I could buy a 4-cylinder small engine internal combustion engine car that got something like 40 miles to the gallon, or I could buy this electronic vehicle. And looking at the costs, it would take 10 years before I would see an economic benefit from getting the electronic vehicle versus getting a car with a small engine and good gas mileage. And paying for 10 years of gasoline is annoying, but you do it over time. Whereas paying that equivalent amount of money up front to make the purchase, that just wasn't feasible. And so we ended up not being able to go with the electronic car. But anyway, yeah, that was just us and our story.
Right. Yeah. So the economics of it certainly are a big deal. And yeah, I think that's one. I guess we'll stay on that because I had one other thing I wanted to mention as well. But okay, so economics of buying a electric vehicle. I know in the United States there are different incentives. There, the government and or even utilities in California give you money for buying an EV. Is that true internationally? And what do you know about kind of the policy or any ideas and how that goes and plays going forward, Joel?
So many countries have put various incentive structures in place to encourage the manufacture and or sale of electronic vehicles. I think it is pretty universal that countries above a certain income point have some sort of a roadmap or a plan in place to bring down emissions, and part of that is to replace internal combustion engines with electronic vehicles. Countries like Norway, which have the highest penetration rate of electronic vehicles, I think something like 80 to 90% of cars sold in Norway are electronic vehicles. And maybe not quite that high, but I think that's in the right ballpark. In large part, that's because the government gives very generous support to the EVs as opposed to ICEs. In China, where I am now, the government has given a range of subsidies, some of them to manufacturers, although I think those are mostly at the central government level have mostly been phased out, although local and provincial incentive structures may still be in existence. And I think they've been focusing more on the consumer side to give rebates or vouchers to consumers, for a certain amount of money. I think those are coming down as well, just because I think the government has realized that there isn't as much of a need to convince people to buy electronic vehicles. Although it's kind of interesting, you've seen this explosive growth here that may be kind of tapering off. That right. There's going to be a tail end of ICE usage. Like, we're not going to go from 10% in 2020 to 50% in 2025, and then 100% 2 years later. It seems more likely that we might reach a point where maybe 70% of vehicles sold are electronic vehicles, and the remaining 30% are still ICEs, just because there's maybe a use case for them, or in some situations they're more economical, or maybe just some consumers just prefer to buy ICEs.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because I'm sure there are different, obviously, governments across different countries to handle this differently. Even governments, state governments in the United States handle this differently. I know California, obviously being where I live, I believe the sale of ICE vehicles is going to be banned in like 6 years or something like that. There is at least a date set at which you're not allowed to sell new ICEs. And so California's taken a very progressive, very hardline stance on making sure that EVs are what we're going to go with. And that does also change the onus, though. Like you mentioned before, like the if you're charging your vehicle using energy that is coming from a coal factory, burning coal, the total net, improvement for the environment is minimal, if any, right? As opposed to if you have a bunch of wind farms or
It's
solar
still
farms.
better.
Oh, it's still better. Okay.
It's still better because even a coal plant, the efficiency is going to be much higher, right? As opposed to,
Okay.
everyone having their own internal combustion engine. So I just want to be clear that it is still preferable, even if your grid was 100% coal, you're still going to have fewer emissions. But it would be better if your grid is, solar powered, wind powered, renewable energy powered, then your emissions do drop to zero, right?
Right. And that takes the onus from the individual and puts it actually on the either the government or the utility to make sure that the grid is powered by renewable sources or environmentally friendly sources. And so that's a different mindset as far as making sure that the government is able to produce enough environmentally friendly energy to both charge the vehicles and all the other current needs. And so that's how is that, are with all these EVs being sold in China, for example, and I know that California's got the same issue. How is the energy grid adapting?
Well, energy policy is a whole nother area that is also very complicated and in ways that I think are not immediately obvious to everyone. We'll just kind of keep it superficial because that's where I'm most comfortable.
Sure.
When you are increasing the supply of renewables to your grid, you have intermittency issues, and you also have basically a question of timing, right? A traditional power plant, coal burning, nuclear, gas, you are running that as a base load all the time, right? You're never turning it off. And you can ramp it up to a certain amount, but it's predictable. You control how much energy is going out. And that's how our grids are designed, with a predictable supply of energy. Renewables, of course, don't work like that. You don't know when the sun's going to be shining, when the wind is going to be blowing, how hard it's going to be blowing. Often you have a mismatch in supply and demand. Sun is usually at its brightest mid-afternoon, early afternoon, and energy demand usually peaks in the evening, or on hot days, for example. Like they don't correlate, and so grid operators have not really. I mean, in order to change, it really requires a kind of root and branch, revamp of how energy is distributed and, importantly, stored. Right, in a traditional grid, your energy storage needs are pretty minimal. The energy is in effect stored in the form of gas, coal, and oil. Right? That's your energy storage. If your energy is being produced by the sun, not so much. So that links back to batteries, right? Probably a different kind of battery. You can use lithium batteries, but people have been experimenting with vanadium batteries, with sodium batteries, sometimes in ways that we don't even think of as batteries, gravity-fed pumps, for example, like when electric energy is cheap, when the sun is shining, the wind is blowing, you pump water uphill, basically, into a big reservoir, and when it's low, you let the water run back downhill, right, through turbines, and then that will. So that's not even a battery in the way that most people think of batteries, but it's a way of storing energy, right? And so that's part of it. The other component, of course, is actually getting the power into your car, right, in a charger. Now, the United States, I think, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 180,000, charging stations, and which is, depending on where you live, either enough or not. I don't know. You can have one installed at your house. I think most people do because it's convenient, right? You just plug your car in at night. And then I'd say in most cases, your car is probably going to have a full charge by the next day. If you're going on long distance journeys, cross country, then you might encounter more problems. And another issue is the charging time, right? You can fill up your car full of gas in about, I don't know what, 2 minutes.
Right.
But it'll take you half an hour, even at a supercharger, I think, to go from almost empty to all the way full. And again, they're working on that. I just read there was a new like experimental battery here in China that they said they could do it in 10 minutes. But still, 10 minutes, that's 5 times as long.
Right.
Now, 10 minutes, I think probably most people would be that okay, would be able to accept a 10-minute charging time. But, what if you can't find a charger? People complain about charging stations being broken when they get there. Or, if you're in line, then, you have 5 cars waiting to use the same charger. That's an hour.
Right.
So those are some of the issues. Also, the maybe the incentive structure as well. I mean, we have, whenever you're replacing something, you kind of have, the new technology that's coming in, right? That's one piece of it. But then you have the incumbent who's being replaced, who are often quite resistant to being replaced, right? They've built their business in a certain way. And so this isn't even talking about ICEs, right? We're just talking about the charging infrastructure. So there's a certain inertia that is difficult to overcome.
Yeah.
Without concerted effort.
Yeah, I know that. Once again, living in Southern California, have you kind of a bit of a skewed take on EVs, because it's like every other vehicle I see is a Tesla, and so I have a charging station literally less than a mile from my house, and so it seems quite simple to charge, and like a lot of these issues have already been. I mean, the energy grid has not fully been addressed. There are still issues. But as far as the ability and availability to get my car charged, that's simple. Which I guess parenthetically here, I don't own a pure EV. I have a hybrid. I have a plug-in hybrid, which I love. It seems to have the best of. It's not the best of both worlds, but it's pretty darn good advantages from both sides. So, but I do, we go on trips to other states, and I see that electric charging stations are significantly more limited, or it's not as easy to get a car charged outside of Southern California. So that's something that different states have different adaptation rates, essentially.
Yeah. So I think in most circumstances, it will require government support to roll that out in a timely fashion, in a way that will help consumers feel comfortable buying an electronic vehicle in the knowledge that there will be charging infrastructure available. Now, I think in an ideal scenario, you would have batteries that have enough range, so a comparable or greater range to ICEs, so people have less range anxiety. You would have charging infrastructure that you could install at your home that didn't cost thousands of dollars like it does now. And then the third piece of that is you have charging that is readily available and quick enough that people are willing to use it, willing to put up with it. Right. And the United States is a large country, relatively sparsely populated, much of it. Right. You live in Southern California. There's a lot of people who live in Southern California. If you live in, the Midwest, if you live in Wyoming, Montana, not so much. Right. So if you are going to expect or hope that people there are going to adopt electronic vehicles at scale, then these are some of the problems that need to be addressed, and the free market probably will not do so. I'm not going to say quickly enough, because I don't really know what enough would be, but it would definitely take some time to overcome those obstacles.
Right. We have listeners all over the world, but I know we have some Northern Canadian listeners, and we've mentioned a few downsides for EVs. I think you said that cold is not great for EVs, right? So, and sparsely populated. So, I mean, really is not a great situation for our Northwest Territories listeners, right?
Yes, if you live in a place like Northern Canada, then first of all, my condolences.
Wow.
Second of all, I would say that yes, EVs, that's a tough sell. I think
Right.
that the efficiency, like the chemistry works, efficiency decreases dramatically when it becomes cold. You have to keep the battery itself at a certain temperature to keep it functional. So some of your electrical generation is now going towards just keeping the battery operational. And you, of course, presumably when you're in the car, you want it to be a relatively comfortable temperature as well. So now you're siphoning more energy to keep your whole car warm. And the generation of heat is a very energy intensive process, as as anyone who's looked at kind of where our energy production is spent, a large chunk of it goes to just heating people's homes. And so you would see dramatic decreases depending on how cold it was in the EV efficiencies. And I don't know if that would really ever change. In theory, you could see a scenario where your batteries are so good that even operating at a 40% efficiency, it's fine, it's acceptable. But yeah, maybe hydrogen.
Those
Right.
batteries are a
That's
ways
something we
off
haven't really
for right
talked
now.
about.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was going to say, so obviously, hopefully in the future we can the those that are in Northwest or Northern Canada or Alaska that listen, you'll have options to you. But as of right now, it's a bit challenging, which is my opportunity, Joel. I'd like to pit. So I use a plug-in hybrid, and I'd love to. I'm going to tell you all the reasons I like my plug-in hybrid. Maybe you can tell me any reasons that plug-in hybrids are not ideal, or like from my perspective, having now owned a plug-in hybrid for a while, environmentally, I have to be giving something like 80% of my emissions, you know, away as far as like the amount of time we run on the ICE versus the battery. It's really only long road trips. When we take a long trip up to Utah or Arizona or whatever else, sure, we don't like the battery's only meant for 30 miles, and so I don't get it's not like I can stop at a charger every 30 miles, but around town, which is the vast majority of my driving and my family's driving, the EV really, it's just the battery. And so, you mentioned the fact that chargers for Teslas you have to get install, and it's expensive. It can be expensive, because the batteries are so much smaller for these plug-in hybrids. You don't need one. You just plug it into a normal outlet, and you charge overnight, and you get your 30 miles the next day, and it seems to be, like I said, I don't know if it's like the long-term solution, but the short-term solution, it seems to be plug-in hybrids really does, give us a situation where we don't have all the emissions from these vehicles, but we get, and we also don't have to deal with all the infrastructure issues immediately. What is your take on that?
I haven't really looked into the policy implications of that. I could. This is me sort of speculating,
I like
right?
speculation.
I think in theory, what you're describing is essentially what Japanese car companies believe and have bet the farm on to some extent. Toyota, at least, heavily invested in hybrid technology.
Right.
Of course, most famously the Prius for a long time. I think this belief that most people will transition gradually. They won't just go straight from an ICE to an electronic vehicle, that hybrids would kind of be an intermediate stepping stone. I don't think that's what we're seeing. And I'm not entirely sure why it is that hybrids never really took off. If I had to guess, I would say that the advantage of a hybrid over an ICE is too limited for most people. Kind of like the difference in product was not significant enough to make persuade consumers or make them think twice about what they were going to buy. And again, I'm not entirely sure why that is the case. It's also possible that, I don't know if it's a marketing image or kind of how hybrids are perceived. And again, EVs were perceived in a certain way for a long time, right? Until I would say Tesla's came out and started reshaping the narrative around electronic vehicles.
Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think you're spot on a lot of that. Because I've looked at a traditional hybrid. We looked at traditional hybrids last time we were in the car market, and it was hard for us to find the motivation to buy a traditional hybrid for some efficiency gains when the economics of it didn't exactly play out. At least that's kind of what I got. But plug-in hybrids took me to a different level, and I don't know, maybe those haven't penetrated far enough. Maybe their game is already up, and people that are interested in plug-in hybrids just take the jump all the way to EV. I don't know, but I'm a convert, and I will evangelize. So
continue to evangelize. If I had to guess, and I will do so, is that hybrids, while they have the advantages of both, to some extent, they also have the disadvantages of both. So, for example, from a manufacturing perspective, Chinese car manufacturers have seized on electronic vehicles and not hybrids with such vigor, I believe, at least in part, because they are pretty straightforward to make and to maintain. And if you introduce an internal combustion engine of any size, the complexity of what you are having to make, maintain, improve on suddenly increases dramatically.
Right.
An electronic car, you can pretty much outsource. You can just buy the parts. If you're making cars, you can buy your electronic motors from someone, you can buy your batteries from someone, and you just almost put it together yourself, right? I mean, that to some extent, I think that is possible. Now, would you sell any of them? That's a different question, but you could make it that easily. And I think that having an internal combustion engine makes that a lot more challenging. It's sort of the neither fish nor fowl. Like I don't know if it would fully satisfy kind of either camp. If you're on the one side, if you're environmental, then you don't want any emissions. You want to remove all of that kind of from the system. And if you are an IC purist, maybe you also feel that having a battery is just an unnecessary inconvenience. I don't know. Yeah, obviously hasn't been your experience, but
no. I mean, I think
there has to be something preventing people from adopting, your perfect plug-in hybrid in mass.
Yeah, well, keep the demand low until I buy a couple more, and then I can evangelize more fully. So, okay, final question for you, Joel. Unless there are other things that you want to cover, but the last thing is, why is the Tesla truck so incredibly ugly?
Oh man, now we are venturing into dangerous territory. I really hate to try and guess what Elon Musk was thinking. Maybe the power went Razor's Edge. Maybe the success. I will say this: it is very distinctive.
That is true.
A word
They
for
are
it.
immediately recognizable. Yeah, there are other words. There are other words, Matt, for sure. It is distinctive. It is. Part of me wonders. I don't know how much you've read about Tesla's manufacturing process. I read an article a while ago talking about how China or Tesla is trying to cast their chassis, like stamp it like a I think the impression was like just basically start with a sheet of metal and you press it into a mold and to create it, right? Because that has a lot of advantages if you can do it, because it's cheap, it's much cheaper. It's stronger because you're not like introducing, you're not welding things together. But it's incredibly complicated. It's like metal origami, right? And trying to do that. And so, as far as I know, they haven't succeeded. But I wonder if part of their motivation was like, well, maybe what if we got rid of like all of the curvy parts of a car? Would that make it easier? I have no idea. That's
a charitable take.
Really,
charitable take on it.
Yes, I'm assuming there's some sort of a rational thought process there. Maybe I'm off base. I don't know. I'm sure that you could. I have not looked into at all why it looks the way it is. So I'm sure that people more qualified than I have delved into that.
I'm sure. But at some degree, at some level, it doesn't. No, there can be no good reason for something like that to exist. Right.
Correct. And this isn't a controversial topic. This is I think, something that any human with humanity remaining can recognize as an accurate fact. That there is no justification for the nature of the Cybertruck.
That being said, there are actually a whole host of them here in Southern California. Like, they're becoming more and more prevalent. I mean, as you would imagine, but
look, there are hosts of,
other bad things.
Yeah, plague rats, for example. Just because there is a host of a thing doesn't mean that it's okay or should be tolerated by right-thinking people.
Very true.
Anyway.
Yes, it is true.
Okay.
It is very, very true.
Yeah.
So now that we've lost our Tesla sponsorship.
No, I appreciate EVs. I appreciate, Joel, you coming on and talking EVs. Any final words, any words of wisdom about the EV before we sign off here?
I will just say that for those whose experience with EVs is limited to Teslas or not even Teslas, I would encourage them to take a look at some of these Chinese models. They are, because there's so many of them and they're trying so many things, there's some really interesting things happening in the market. I'll just mention one. One Chinese car manufacturer has a system that is entirely voice activated. So everything in the car, like, it doesn't have buttons. If you want to wind down the windows, if you want to turn on the headlights, it's all voice activated. Maybe that's stupid and everyone will hate it, but it's just kind of an indication of they're just at this sort of like throwing things at the wall and saying what stage of development, which is an interesting place to be, because you end up with all of these crazy idiosyncratic ideas that it's fun to watch. Anyway,
that is very fun. That is very interesting. I'd love to interact with that car. It almost sounds like a Herbie type scenario.
Well, okay, so I saw that technology demonstrated in the documentary film G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra, where,
well, then it works.
Or maybe it was the original. I don't know, but it was basically the plane was voice activated, and the guy literally had to yell fire in order to shoot it. So yeah, like employ the weapons. So you have pilots running around yelling bang, 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 bang to operate their systems. I can imagine this in bad traffic with bad drivers where they're all yelling honk, 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 honk at each other. Yeah.
Got a bunch of geese out there.
Yeah,
that's probably not how you say it in Chinese, though, to be fair. So
I bet it's even more I bet it's even more in Chinese.
All right. Well, I appreciate it, Joel. It's been very informative and entertaining. So it's a good combination. And we'll have to have you back on sometime in the future to when we get more EV insight and more exposure here that we can talk a little bit more about. Well, whatever you want, actually. It doesn't have to be EVs. Anyway.
All right.
Thank you, Joel.
Do
Thanks,
it.
Matt. We'll join us again next podcast.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah.